The ship creaks beneath cold feet. Above, through the haze of smoke and alcohol, a young woman sees wooden beams, painted shields, faces blurred by drink and ritual. Her hands tremble, not from fear, they tell her, from anticipation, from honor. The old woman they call the Angel of Death grips her arm, guiding her toward the pavilion where her master lies dressed in silk, surrounded by slaughtered animals. The woman has been drinking for days, singing, celebrated as a volunteer. But now, as the rope coils around her neck and the dagger gleams in wrinkled hands, one question burns through the fog of her intoxicated mind. Did she ever really have a choice? This is the moment Ahmad Ibn Fadlan witnessed on the banks of the Volga River in the year 922. A funeral, a sacrifice, a window into a world we've chosen to forget. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear isn't the Viking story you learned in school. And wherever you're listening from, whether you're at home, on a commute, or late at night when the world is quiet, you're about to discover a truth that's been buried for over 1,000 years. A truth about the people who built the Viking world. The ones who had no swords, no ships, no sagas written in their honor. The ones who lived and died in the shadows. Let's go back. Back before that funeral. Back to where it all began. There's a story we tell ourselves about the Vikings. Warriors, explorers, craftsmen of genius who sailed to the edges of the known world. We celebrate their longships, their intricate silver work, their poetry that echoed through generations without ever needing to be written down. Museums display their treasures, television shows romanticize their raids. We've turned them into legends. But here's what those museums don't tell you. Here's what the sagas conveniently forgot. The Viking world wasn't built by warriors alone. It was built on the backs of people who had no choice, no voice, no names we remember. People called Thralls. Up to 1 in every 4 people living in Viking age, Scandinavia was enslaved, 25%. Walk through a Viking village, and every 4th person you passed was property, not a citizen, not even fully human in the eyes of the law. In Norwegian legal language, thralls weren't referred to with masculine or feminine pronouns. They were referred to in the neuter, the same grammar used for objects, for tools, for livestock, and this wasn't some minor detail of Viking society. This was the engine, the fuel that powered everything we admire about them. Without thralls, there would be no legendary raids, no trade routes stretching from Ireland to Baghdad, no elaborate burial mounds filled with treasure. As archaeologist Neil Price puts it simply, this was a slave economy. Yet in the 19th century, when Norway and Sweden and Denmark were building their national identities, when they needed heroes to rally around, they created a myth, the proud Viking Age. Noble warriors fighting for glory. They left the thralls out of the story entirely. It was easier that way, cleaner, more inspiring, but the truth doesn't disappear just because we stop talking about it. And the archaeological evidence, the written accounts, the DNA buried in our bones, they all tell the same story, a story of suffering we've only just begun to acknowledge. So how did it happen? How did someone become a thrall? Picture a monastery on the Irish coast. Stone walls, quiet prayers, illuminated manuscripts created by hands that have spent years perfecting each letter, each swirl of color. It's early morning, mist rising from the sea. Then the ships arrive. The Vikings didn't just come for gold and silver, though they took that too. They came for people. Monks were dragged from their prayers. Families were torn from their homes. Women, children, anyone who couldn't fight back or run fast enough. The Annals of Ulster from the year 821 describe it plainly. A great number of women were carried off into captivity. This happened over and over across Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, down into France, even as far south as Spain and North Africa. The raids weren't just about plunder, they were about procurement. Human beings were cargo, and they were valuable. But you didn't need to be captured in a raid to become a thrall. In Viking society, certain crimes were punished by enslavement. Theft, especially if you stole, you might find yourself handed over to your victim as property. If you accumulated debts you couldn't pay, slavery became the payment. And if both your parents were thralls, you were born into chains that would likely never come off. Some thralls were created by Vikings themselves. When a free man impregnated an enslaved woman and refused to acknowledge the child, that child became a thrall. Generation after generation, the chains were inherited, and once you were taken, once you were enslaved, you entered a network, a vast, sprawling machine of human trafficking that stretched across the known world. The captives from Irish raids weren't necessarily kept by their captors. Most entered the wider trade network, transported to markets across the Viking world and far beyond. Archaeological evidence shows us the routes. From Dublin, the epicenter of the Western slave trade, ships carried human cargo to Hedeby in Denmark, to Birka in Sweden, to Kaupang in Norway. From there, some thralls were sold to Norse farmers who needed labor, but many others traveled further, down rivers into what is now Russia and Ukraine, to Bulgar on the Volga. From there, they were sold again, passing through the hands of Arab merchants, eventually reaching markets as distant as Baghdad, Constantinople, even the markets of Central Asia. The word slave itself comes from this trade, from Slavic. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were targeted so systematically, so relentlessly, that their ethnic name became synonymous with bondage. But this was all abstract, right? Just trade routes on a map. Let's talk about what the markets actually looked like. Hedeby, the largest trading center in the Viking world, located at the border between Scandinavia and the territories to the south. If you walk through Hedeby in the year 900, you'd see merchants from across Europe. You'd hear a dozen languages. You'd smell cooking fires, see silver being weighed, watch craftsmen at their work, and you'd see the thralls. They stood in markets, sometimes shackled. Archaeologists have found iron collars at Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka, designed to prevent escape, designed to mark ownership. Some of these collars are in museums now, cold and rusted, but once they pressed against living throats. Once they were locked around the necks of children, women, men who had names we'll never know. There are records of prices, fragments that survived in old laws and documents. A female thrall cost approximately 1 cow and 1 ox. 3 cows equaled a horse. 4 male thralls were needed to purchase a suit of chainmail. Human beings reduced to units of exchange, their value calculated against livestock and weaponry. In Dublin, which became the center of the Western slave trade, the market was enormous. DNA evidence discovered in recent years shows just how far the reach extended. Some people in Scotland today can trace their ancestry to Saharan tribes whose ancestors came to Spain with the Moorish conquest, were then captured in Viking raids on Spain, brought to Dublin, and sold to Scottish landowners in the 9th century. Another study suggests many thralls were shipped to Iceland. their genes now woven into the population. An Arab merchant named Ibn Hokal described a Viking slave trade in 977 that extended across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. Thralls from northern Europe were funneled through Scandinavia, through Russia, to Byzantium and Baghdad. The profits were staggering. Silver flowed back into Scandinavia. Arabic dirhams have been found buried across Viking territories, payment for human cargo. A monk visiting Hedeby in 870 was so horrified to see Christian thralls for sale that he sold everything he owned and bought their freedom on the spot. His shock was recorded, but his individual act of mercy didn't stop the machine. The trade continued for centuries, but what happened after you were sold? What was life actually like? Imagine living in darkness, not metaphorical darkness, literal darkness. Thralls typically lived in the darkest end of the longhouse, sharing space with the animals, cows, goats, pigs, the smell of manure and straw, the cold seeping through gaps in the wood, while free families gathered around the central hearth, while they ate and laughed and told stories. Thralls existed in the margins, in the shadows. A 14th century poem, likely originating from the end of the Viking era, lists names given to thralls: bastard, sluggard, stumpy, stinker, lout, names designed to dehumanize, to remind them and everyone else what they were. The work was relentless. Thralls did everything free people didn't want to do. They cut down trees in freezing forests. They built ships that would carry Vikings to new lands. They rowed those ships, muscles screaming, backs bent under the whip or the watchful eye of their masters. They dug peat from cold bogs. They hauled stones for building projects. They tended livestock, cooked meals, cleaned waste, sowed fields, harvested grain. The saga of Olaf describes thralls belonging to Erling Skjalgsson, a powerful jarl in Norway. The saga was written centuries later, but it might contain truth. It says Erling gave his 30 thralls a day's work, but after that work was done, they had twilight and night hours to labor for themselves. He gave them land to farm, and if they worked hard enough, some could buy their freedom within a year or two. This sounds almost humane, almost kind. But here's the reality: that saga was written by free men centuries later, probably trying to make their ancestors look merciful. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Analysis of bones from Viking-era graves shows that thralls ate poorly compared to their masters. While free Vikings consumed meat and dairy, thralls subsisted heavily on fish. Their bones show signs of malnutrition, of bodies worn down by constant labor. And they had no rights, none. An owner could punish a thrall as much as he wanted, for any reason or no reason at all. If you didn't obey quickly enough, you were beaten. If you tried to resist, you were beaten worse. If you ran and were caught, the punishment could be death. The law didn't protect you. The law didn't recognize you as fully human. But the physical labor, the hunger, the beatings, those weren't even the worst of it. The bodies of thralls weren't their own. They were available for exploitation, sexual exploitation. This isn't speculation. The sources are explicit. Ahmad Ibn Fadlan, that Arab diplomat who traveled to meet the Vikings in 922, described what he saw with his own eyes. 2 attractive young women, slaves about to be sold, were publicly abused by their owners while others watched. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't shameful in their eyes. It was treated as normal, as a right of ownership. Women and children were particularly vulnerable. Female thralls served in households, and their masters could use them however they wished. No consent was required, no permission needed. Many thralls were born from these unions, children of free fathers and enslaved mothers. If the father acknowledged the child, it might become free, but if he didn't, and most didn't, the child inherited the mother's chains. William Fitzhugh, an archaeologist at the Smithsonian, states it plainly: female thralls were concubines, cooks, and domestic workers. Those categories weren't separate, they overlapped, and the women had no say in which role they would fill at any given moment. Children captured in raids were seen as particularly valuable. They were adaptable, easier to control. They could be molded into whatever their owners needed. Some were trained as skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, jewelers, shipwrights. Their skills made them more valuable, but that value came at the cost of any chance at freedom. A skilled thrall was too useful to release. The psychological torture of this life is almost impossible to imagine. You wake in darkness. You work until your body screams. You eat scraps. You're beaten when you're too slow, used when someone wants you, and through it all, you have to watch free people live the life you'll never have. You have to serve them, smile when they demand it, pretend gratitude for the smallest mercy, and even death wouldn't set you free. Remember that funeral we started with? Let's go back there now. Let's see what really happened. When a wealthy Viking died, the funeral preparations took 10 days. During those 10 days, the body was placed in a temporary grave while clothes were sewn and arrangements were made. And while those preparations happened, his thralls were asked a question: which of you wishes to die with him? According to Ibn Fadlan's account, it was usually enslaved women who volunteered. Once someone said yes, there was no backing out. The sources are clear about this. Even if he wished to, he would not be allowed to. So what does volunteering mean when refusal isn't an option? The woman who volunteered was treated well for those 10 days. She was given special food, strong drink, allowed to sing and celebrate. People called it an honor. They told her she was special, chosen, that she would serve her master in the afterlife, that she would see her own dead family again in the next world. But what they didn't tell her, or maybe they did, and she had no choice but to accept it, was what would happen on that final day. On the day of the funeral, the dead chieftain's ship was pulled ashore and mounted on a wooden platform. A bed was prepared with rich silks. The body was exhumed, dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by weapons and food and drink. Then the sacrifices began. A dog was cut in half, both pieces placed in the ship. 2 horses, run until they sweated, then slaughtered. 2 cows, a rooster, a hen, all cut apart, their bodies arranged around the dead man. And then came the woman. She was given more drink. She sang. She said farewell to other thralls, women who watched and knew they might be next when their own masters died. She was lifted up by men, raised above a wooden door frame, and 3 times she was asked what she saw. 3 times she answered that she saw the afterlife, saw her family, saw her master waiting. Maybe she believed it by then. Maybe the alcohol made her believe. Or maybe she was just saying what they wanted to hear. They brought her to the ship. Into the pavilion where her master lay, the angel of death, an old woman who presided over these rituals, was waiting. The woman was held down by hands and feet. A rope was wrapped around her neck and pulled tight from both directions. And while she was being strangled, the angel of death stabbed her repeatedly with a broad-bladed dagger. Ibn Fadlan notes that outside the ship, men banged their shields with sticks, creating noise. To cover the screams, he was told. so that other enslaved women wouldn't be discouraged from volunteering in the future. Then everything was set on fire. The ship, the bodies, the sacrifices, all burned together. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice. On the Isle of Man, a wealthy Viking's tomb includes the remains of a young woman killed by a blow to the head, mixed with ashes of cremated animals. Elise Naumann, an archaeologist at the University of Oslo, discovered decapitated bodies in Viking graves that showed no kinship to the main burial. They bore signs of mistreatment. Their bones revealed diets heavy in fish, while their masters ate better. They were thralls, sacrificed when their owners died. The usual grave for a thrall who died naturally was barely a grave at all, a hole in the ground, sometimes not even that. Ibn Fadlan wrote that when a poor thrall died, their body was left for dogs and carrion birds to devour. Even in death, they weren't considered human enough to deserve burial. But was there any escape? Any path to freedom? Technically, yes. Theoretically, a thrall could be manumitted, granted freedom by their owner. A rune stone from Herning in Jutland reads, "Toki Smith raised the stone in memory of Thorgisel Guðmundar's son, who gave him gold and freedom." Toki, a craftsman, had been enslaved. His master chose to free him. But this was rare. Extraordinarily rare. A thrall represented an investment, free labor. Why give that up? Some thralls could, in theory, purchase their freedom. If they were allowed to keep a tiny portion of what they earned at market, if they saved for years, if they were never robbed or punished by having those savings taken away, then maybe, just maybe, they could buy themselves free. The saga of Olaf mentions thralls achieving this within a year or two, but remember, that saga was written to make the Jarl look generous. The reality was that most thralls died as thralls, and even if you did gain freedom, you didn't gain equality. Freed thralls occupied the lowest rung of free society. They were still marked by their past, still looked down upon, still limited in what they could own, where they could go, who they could marry. There was one group that had a better chance, captives from wealthy families. If you were nobility, if you had relatives who could pay ransom, you might be bought back. The Vikings understood this. Sometimes they specifically targeted high-status individuals, not to enslave permanently, but to ransom. It was profitable, but this only worked if your family was alive, wealthy, and willing to pay. For the vast majority, for the Irish farmers and Slavic villagers and English monks, there was no ransom, no buyback, no escape. So how did it end? How did a system this entrenched, this profitable, finally collapse? The answer came slowly, gradually. It came with Christianity. As Viking nations converted, as Denmark and Norway and Sweden became officially Christian in the 11th century, attitudes began to shift. The church taught that Christians should not enslave other Christians. This wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was practical, political, but it had consequences. Vikings could no longer conduct slave raids against Christian Europe without facing condemnation from their own religious authorities. The supply of new thralls began to dry up, and without fresh captives, the economic model started to crumble. The thralls already enslaved in Scandinavia didn't suddenly go free. Many died in bondage, but some were manumitted as their owners aged or converted, or simply decided the practice had become too controversial. Others remained enslaved, but saw their children born free. By the 13th century, slavery in Scandinavia had been largely replaced by serfdom, which was still oppressive, but at least recognized a person as human under the law. The Codex Holmiensis from 1241 still contained rules regarding thralls, showing the practice lingered, but it was fading. And what happened to the freed thralls? Where did they go? Most stayed. Going home required resources most didn't have. If you'd been taken from Ireland 15 years earlier, what was there to return to? Your village might be gone, your family dead or scattered. You didn't know the language anymore, didn't know the land, and you had nothing. No money, no skills that would be valued, no connections. So they stayed in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark. They married, they had children, they became part of the population, which means something remarkable, something we don't talk about enough. If you have Scandinavian ancestry, you're as likely to be descended from Thralls as from Vikings. The people who were enslaved, who suffered, who survived, they're in your blood just as much as the warriors and raiders we celebrate. Their DNA is woven into modern populations across Northern Europe. Their descendants are everywhere, but we don't tell their stories. We don't build monuments to them. We don't write sagas in their honor. In the 19th century, when Norway was fighting for independence from Sweden, national identity became crucial. They needed heroes. They needed a past to be proud of. So they reached back to the Viking Age and pulled out the parts they wanted. The warriors, the explorers, the craftsmen. They left out the thralls. It was too uncomfortable, too complicated, easier to pretend it hadn't been that important, easier to focus on the glory. But that's not history, that's mythology. So here we are, at the end of this story that's not really a story, it's a reckoning. Every artifact we admire from the Viking Age, every ship, every piece of jewelry, every settlement and fortification was built at least in part by enslaved hands. Every successful raid that brought back silver and prestige also brought back human beings in chains. Every powerful jarl, every wealthy merchant, every legendary warrior existed in a world where up to 1 in 4 people around them were property. This doesn't mean we can't appreciate Viking craftsmanship or be fascinated by their travels, but it means we have to see the whole picture. We have to acknowledge that the foundation of that world was suffering, that behind every achievement was someone with no choice, no freedom, no voice. The Thralls didn't write their own history. They couldn't. They were too busy surviving, so their stories were told by others, or more often, not told at all. They became invisible, forgotten, erased from the narrative we wanted to hear. But the evidence remains: the iron collars in museums, the bones with marks of malnutrition and violence, the graves where people were buried like objects, decapitated and thrown in beside their masters. The DNA in our blood, the word slave itself, echoing across centuries. They were here. They mattered. They built the world we study and admire. And maybe the most important question isn't just what life was like for them. Maybe the most important question is why we've worked so hard to forget they existed at all. What other histories have we sanitized? What other truths have we buried because they complicate the stories we want to tell about ourselves? These are questions worth sitting with, worth thinking about, long after this video ends. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, take a moment, think about the Thralls, the people whose names we don't know, whose faces we'll never see, who lived and died in the shadows so that others could stand in the light. They deserve to be remembered.